Greetings to those of you who tune in via the YouTube channel. Thank you for listening or paying attention in a visual way. And I'm grateful once again to be able to be with those of you who are here and anybody who might be listening in around campus through the live stream. Chapel has a rotation of topics, and this one is a classic in the realm of spiritual understanding, what I was taught to call theology, but which today I realize you can call it dogma, doctrine, spiritual teachings, understanding across the wide variety of wisdom traditions. But any good wisdom tradition worth its salt has to engage with the reality of suffering. And I know you're excited. Suffering. I sort of feel similarly because it's a daunting subject area, and I want a disclaimer out here in the next 20 minutes or so. I will not solve the problem. It's a dilemma, and I don't know that I really realized before I became a practical theologian, how much thought had been given to it, or how thorny the theological and philosophical issues are that attach to the reality of our pain. But I've been doing practical theology for a long time, and this place especially, people come into relationship with the organization that's called Caron Treatment Centers because of some experience of suffering. It's inevitable. We don't tend to have people who want to connect with us because everything's going great, and so there's a peculiar subset of the kinds of suffering that I have in view that have to do with what we call use disorders. That's the medical terminology for addiction today. And I think that's illuminating here a little bit because what happens when you're a person who suffers from a use disorder is that you either are in relationship, behavior, or consumption of something that other people can relate to, behave with, or consume without a problem, but your experience is disordered. So if you're, for example, if you have a food-related disorder, you still have to eat, and everybody has to eat. All of us consume substances. I took Tylenol yesterday, but my problem is when I take things out of medicine bottles, I have a history of not doing that in the same way that other people do who don't have disordered use issues. So, and the reason I say that is because suffering is sort of like that. Suffering is everywhere. Everyone will suffer. One of the insights I came to early on in my practice of ministry was that suffering isn't doled out evenly. Some people suffer more than others. But there's also some suffering that is offensive, and that if one had the magic wand, one would eradicate, right? And at a large level, I'm thinking of today in the public eye, we have Gaza and the Ukraine are places where I hope that you have empathy for the realities of suffering that are being thrown up on our television screens, day after day. And then I was thinking about that this morning. I was thinking about the continent of Africa. And were we to be watching on our screens, and we would see, that's an entire continent that is basically living those same kind of day-to-day realities, many of its back neighborhoods all the time, and yet it's as if we do the same thing that sometimes addicted people and their families do, which is just tune out because you can't. There's a window of tolerance. There's only so much suffering that I feel like we can tolerate and attend to before it's just ugh. And so I used to think that it was helpful to distinguish between natural suffering and human sufferings, Hatfields and McCoys, or bitternesses that are caused between people. Unfortunately, today with climate issues in vogue, even the natural world suffering sort of has our fingerprints on it. So it's no longer as useful a distinction as at one time it was, but we still have the risk of a comet hitting the planet is not necessarily something that I would say would be as much our fault as not. And this is the truth, that there are some sufferings that one can see oneself as relatively blameless in, but nonetheless experience, and some sufferings that are just, they activate the whole shame, guilt thing, because it's pretty easy to connect the dots and realize that you wouldn't be in the pickle if it were not for the behavior that you participated in. And that tends to be the addiction landscape. Interestingly, the docs tell us that a lot of the addicts' behavior is not within their own scope of control, and yet, I will tell you, most people who are addicted and start getting sober feel this immense shame and guilt. And I don't think it's just either or and easy to wipe it away, or nor do I think we should disregard the medical insight that choice is taken away from a person. So, suffering is a perennial issue. It's a universal experience. It's part of what brings people to the relationship with me in this place, and a lot of it's our fault. What helped me this week as I was trying to think, what am I going to do? I don't know if this is the 18th or 19th time I've engaged this subject in this place, but I always try to think, what can I say new or different? I thought, I know what I'll do. I will address response to suffering. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, was how we respond in the experience of suffering. And I was recently in a training that was around trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a diagnosis. So there's a continuum from a small ouch to very serious ouches. And there's different ways in which, even with very serious ouches, people may or may not become diagnosable with a PTSD diagnosis. But anyway, in this training, I saw something. When I'm an old guy. So when I was young, I was taught that the primal response to fear was fight or flight. I don't know if any of you are old enough to have been taught that. But later I heard, and I thought, I better fix my understanding, because then I heard fight, flight, or freeze, which I sort of get. And then this last one, I'm like, or fawn? So apparently there's new insight into the complexity of the reptilian brain. So we've been mean to those poor lizards. And they don't know well enough to feel like they've been attacked by our cognitive schema. But anyway, human beings respond at a primal level to threat. And we have a variety of responses to threat that the behaviorists tell us are fight, flight, fawn, freeze. And I think that's true in the case of suffering too, right? Like, in fact, as I was talking about, I think we tune out the African continent suffering because it's a flight response, and I've watched this happen so many times with people who need a break from their misery, and I think unfortunately often, for me, the bottle of scotch or the bender on something else was really an anesthetic to the sufferings that I thought it would help me with. And then the problem is the next morning I have the hangover and the sufferings are still there. So, but reptilian responses are not the only choice in the human toolkit. We have another way of responding to suffering. And the part of the human response to suffering that I most want to call to our attention this morning is through two words: love and service. So people do respond to the experience or witness of suffering with love and service. And if you've been hanging around the world of addiction and recovery for a long time, you know a term that is falling out of vogue, but it's still used a lot because it's pretty handy, even though it's hard to pin down. It's codependency, right? And this is where we can find ourselves feeling ashamed for helping people who are suffering. And there's something about that bothers me. Like, I don't know, I still like to, hold the door for my wife out of manners, and I still, when I see my grandchild, have a scrape, I want to kiss the boo-boo. And I mean, day to day, I function as a pastor and a clergy person in a medical environment because I feel called to love and serve. I had a friend who was in recovery when we were in seminary together. He goes, "Look at all of us, we're codependents for Christ." And it's pretty funny, really. And I just think it's hyperbole. It goes too far to make fun of this response, to make fun of the helping instinct Is it fair to call it to make fun of the helping vocation? Let me call it that. What will we do if we didn't have people who responded to crisis with love and service? It would be a horrible world. It would be so tragic if we didn't have people show up. And I have all these confessions that come out on Sunday mornings. I watch the Today Show a fair amount, and I'm not proud of it. But anyway, they have these, I forget what they call them, but they're soft-hearted moments, like really good moments. And almost always it's like a military person who's coming home and comes and surprises the child in the school environment or whatever, you know. And that, like, I can cry at a coffee commercial, but the evocation of empathy in me for the witness of somebody being of service to another person in the context of suffering it's a real thing. It's beautiful when you see someone moved by someone's distress. Penelope tied to the railroad tracks was a thing, like, and here I come to save the day. You know, we make fun of that, but where I want to go is I want to also point out that to me that's sacred and not to be made fun of. In my journey of recovery, I was taught to find a power greater than myself to rely on, to help me. And I had terrible trouble with that. But one of the reasons why I had trouble with that, I'm counting on this all coming together, is because I misinterpreted what I was looking for. I thought people were telling me that I could find kind of what we learn about, like, and this is actually to some degree the Sunday school or Hebrew school's fault. Because when we teach children, we teach them about Santa Claus, and we teach them about a God who, you know, answers the prayers with the exact request that we have. We don't teach theology that includes disappointment and hardship and long waiting. But, so that's what I thought. I thought when I was in Alcoholics Anonymous and they were telling me to go out and find a higher power, I was supposed to go find, like, the lottery machine, you know, yay! And, like, I would make sick people well, and I would, you know, my financial worries would go away, and the woman of my dreams would show up, which eventually has happened in my life, thank you God. But I misunderstood what I was looking for. And so I didn't know that what I would find was a God who shows up in these extraordinary moments of care in the face of suffering. And, I mean, apparently there's a Mark Twain satire about heaven. It makes fun of it because it's like it's essentially boring. But there's a point there, right? Because if I think about flowers and the beauty of flowers, I don't really, my mind is not moved to think just about, you know, you get those catalogs of the tulips in Holland, and there's just like a bazillion tulips and they're all in perfect bloom. One tulip doesn't really sing in an environment of 10 million tulips all in bloom. Where the tulip I want to tell you about is a tulip I saw once come up from a crack in concrete because somebody had planted tulips there and then paved over them. And that little bulb found its way to sunlight. It was like a beautiful thing. If I lived in, you know, one of these climates where there was a sunrise every day that was just beautiful and the climate was something, I always think, I kind of want that. But you know, the real beautiful day that I still remember, I remember a young boy being in Sarasota, Florida, and there being one of these hurricanes that came out of the Gulf. And you know, my family took shelter. And I remember the next day after the hurricane, we stood on this beach that was devastated with all this wreckage, and the weather was beautiful. And I remember, like, the beautiful day after the tempest, or the flower that comes through the difficulty. Or I was watching something where the Woman in Gold. It's a beautiful movie, and one of the characters in The Woman in Gold is supposedly descended from Schoenberg, the composer who does 12-tone composition, which is complicated to listen to if you've not listened to 12-tone music. My dear friend Marty's like got a little bit of a grimace, but I will say I have been in performances of that music where at the end I have been moved to realize that in all the dissonance there is something beautiful that comes about in my experience of it. And so where I'm trying to go, I guess it's obvious, but is to call us to discover the sacred in the manure, in the flower that grows there. And I think that's this. I mean, there was a period of time when I thought that television too, like Leave It to Beaver, and I mean like, you know, somebody would say, oh, well, the Brady Bunch wasn't all good because they had plot lines that were complicated. But I'm like, no, I'm sorry, you can't make that claim about the Brady Bunch. Like, go read the Oresteia in Greek tragedy. Go read Shakespeare. Go read Homer. And what you realize is that for millennia, it's not a new thing. Dexter is not a new thing. We have not suddenly made our characters of our stories more complicated. They have been complicated forever. But somehow in the 1920s and in the decades beyond that, American media culture got into this depiction of the sweet, comfortable life that's a lie, when the truth is that the most noble and beautiful things that we see in people are noble and beautiful things that come out of very imperfect people, which gives it room for you and me. I mean, if there's a noble, beautiful person here who doesn't have crap going on, raise your hand. But I challenge you, right? And there's a sacredness in the overcoming of our imperfection and in the willingness to manifest love and service in the face of the crap of this difficult thing that we call life. And to rise to the call of the hurts of our generation is the task that we have to manifest what I would call the presence and love of God. Instead of waiting for him, her, or it to show up, we become the sacred for one another when we bandage each other's wounds, when we love one another out of affliction, when we visit one another in the journey towards death, when we, in the Christian tradition, it's to give sight to the blind, hearing to those who are not able to hear, liberty to the oppressed, and God's preferential option for the poor. That was one of the things I was taught, was that recognizing that people don't all have like comfortable existences and resources, but that where beauty is best to be found is in attention to where it is most lacking. And I think that's us. I count myself as a person like that. My addict story is terrible. I'm so ashamed of some of the things that happen. I'm ashamed of some of the things that happened in my early sobriety. And no, you're not going to get the whole gory confession on tape here, but because that would be a mistake. It would be a self-centeredness thing, which I struggle with too. The invitation that I want to finish with for us today is to call us to be this, to be love for one another, and to recognize that we have that in our response range, as well as primal fight or flight stuff. We don't have to hit back. We don't have to wound. We don't have to turtle. We don't have to feign some sort of distraction that moves the event to another thing. We can move to the place of suffering with love. And today's a family education day. I know that's why you're here. I know that's why you're here. And some of you are probably fed up with the money and the antics and some of the patients who are here are terrified that they will continue to inflict the harm. One thing I have not said, but I wanted to say, it's like way back in my outline, but I'm going to say it here, is that people who suffer from addiction, in large measure, I think, do not have the capacity to see how much their behavior is harmful to others. while it's going on. So those of us who are around them are like, how could you do this? How could you screw up Christmas? How could you spend that money? How could you blow up your life? How could you, like whatever? And want to say, don't you know what this is doing to me because I love you? And the answer is, I don't know. Sadly, it's bizarre. And you want to think, oh gosh, is my loved one a sociopath? Sometimes, sadly, but more often than not, it's this peculiar blindness I'm talking about. I think it's some sort of part of the addictive journey, is that, and maybe it's a survival mechanism, is that like we start tuning it out like the African suffering. We tune out the suffering of the others who are right around us in order to be able to continue to participate in the behavior that our conscience would tell us we should not do. And once the conscience has been silenced, it sort of goes dark. And then what happens is that there's this awakening to moral significance in the part of most of us when we get sober. It took me quite some time, but when it hit me, it was grievous and awful. And I still carry it today. I regret that I and others suffered harm because of where this use disorder took me. Is some of it my fault? Sure. Is some of it not my fault? Yes. Some of it I could not intercept it. Once the ball was rolling down the hill, I could not pull myself up by my own bootstraps. I could not stop the careening down the hill. I needed intervention from the outside. And good and loving people came to my rescue in the act of love and service to meet me in my place of suffering and show me God. Show me what it meant. Like, this is what I'm saying. And I know that everybody wants, not everybody, many of you may want me to profess, a Charlton Heston-like figure who looms in the clouds and tinkers with our day-to-day. And I have real trouble with that framing of it. But I do believe that what I have found is so sacred. What I am talking about is, to me, where I discover God at work. In you and in this place, in what happens when, I remember, Tina may remember this, we had a colleague, a member of the spiritual care team who ended up no longer being able to work here as a chaplain, but I remember I learned he was in a parking lot and there was a person who was discovered in an overdose, and he found the Narcan and brought this person back from overdose when everybody else was in that paralysis of like, oh, somebody else will do it. There's a term for that. When a bunch of people should help, but everybody thinks somebody else is going to do it. And our loved one, whose first initial was T, jumped in and saved a life. And that is, if you don't think that's miraculous, it's miraculous. And yes, it depends on the function of a chemical, but watch somebody come back from Narcan, and it's hard to not think it's bizarrely more than normal. So, I hope I have been able to overlay what may feel like an ordinary and crappy thing to be here with the notion that there's a miracle around every corner here. There is sacredness and there is love and there is God as I understand God in you and what you do and who you become and how today somebody comes back to celebrate a coin and his celebration will help one another. And the music that we just heard is balm for the soul. We are those tulips that shine through the crack. We are, and this day that is so beautiful is the day after the storm. I can't fix suffering, but I can attend to it. And so will you. Let's get busy about it. Thanks. God bless.